My name is Rachel Morgan. I'm 33. At my brother's wedding, I finally spoke up about my little shop. But Ethan smirked and said, "If you disappeared tomorrow, no one would even notice." Everyone laughed. That night I made a vow I would disappear, but only to return as someone they could never ignore. The night of Ethan's wedding still lingers in me like a memory pressed into glass, unyielding and sharp. Austin glowed in gold that evening, the sunset spilling over towers of glass and the wide reach of oaks that had grown long before my family's fortune. The Morgan name carried its own weight in Texas, and the ballroom that night reflected every ounce of it. Chandeliers shimmered above like frozen constellations. Violins filled the air with elegance, and waiters circled with trays of champagne that caught the light like liquid fire. I walked through the doors, holding my breath steady though my chest felt tight. My navy dress, pressed carefully that morning, looked modest among sequins and silk that glittered on other women. The perfume of roses mixed with the sharper notes of luxury scents followed me as I passed, each kiss on the cheek, each laugh a reminder of a world where belonging came easily to others. I kept my shoulders pulled back, my clutch tucked in my hand, as if posture alone could make me visible. It was Ethan's night. Ethan Morgan, 35, the golden sun. He stood radiant beside his bride, who looked like she had been poured into lace ivory falling around her like water. She glowed with a joy that seemed untouched by the barbed edges that too often lay hidden beneath my family's charm. I smiled at her without envy because in her eyes I saw something pure, something unmarked by the weight I had carried for years. The reception grew louder as the night deepened. Laughter rippled down the long table where candles flickered against crystal and polished silver. I sat in my chair, quiet hands resting on the stem of a glass, waiting for a chance. For weeks I had rehearsed the words, promising myself I would not let this night pass without speaking. I was tired of vanishing into the wallpaper, tired of being nothing more than the polite nod at the end of introductions. When the noise fell for a brief moment, I leaned forward. My heart pressed hard against my ribs, my throat dry, but I steadied my voice. I spoke of the small online shop I had started in 2015, how I designed simple gadgets for families and the thrill of seeing the first orders arrive. I told them about evenings bent over my kitchen table, sketching designs about the quiet hope that something small could grow into something meaningful. I wanted just once to be heard without dismissal, to be seen not as an afterthought, but as someone who could create. For a second, I thought the words might land. But Ethan leaned back in his chair, smirk tugging at his lips. He tapped the rim of his glass with his fork, the sharp metallic clink cutting through the murmur of the table. His voice rang out clear, steady, full of amusement. "If you disappeared tomorrow, no one would even notice." Silence pressed down heavy and short-lived before it broke into laughter. My uncle slapped his shoulder, my father chuckled. Even my mother's laugh joined, soft and indulgent, the way she always saved it for Ethan's cleverness. The sound swelled until it filled every corner of the table. Each burst of laughter struck me like a cold wind. Heat crept up my neck, the sting rising in my throat. My fingers gripped the stem of my glass so tightly I feared it might crack in my hand. I wanted to speak, to ask them how they could turn cruelty into entertainment. But the words caught inside me, heavy and immovable. I lifted my glass. My hand trembled, but I forced it, still raising it until the candlelight struck the surface. My gaze locked with Ethan's, steady, unflinching. In that silence, something inside me shifted. It was not humiliation anymore. It was resolved, solid and sharp, a vow I did not need to speak. Challenge accepted. For the first time, Ethan's grin faltered. A flicker crossed his face, almost invisible, before the music swelled again and the moment dissolved into celebration. The rest of the evening passed in fragments. Dancers spun across the floor, shoes tapping against polished wood. Photographers caught smiles and embraces in frozen flashes. I sat still, my body present, but my thoughts drifting, the laughter still echoing in my ears, carried on a tide of humiliation. Yet beneath it, something unfamiliar rose, a strength I had never felt before, sharp enough to steady me in my seat. When the celebration spilled into the night, I stepped outside for air. The garden was hushed under the Texas sky, the scent of honeysuckle weaving through the breeze. The music inside dimmed behind closed doors, and the silence pressed against me like a cloak. For the first time in years, I let myself breathe fully. I thought of Ethan's words, of the way the family had laughed as though I were a story told for their amusement. If they wanted me to disappear, I would. But not into nothingness, not into the shadows they had written for me. I would step out of the narrow box they had built, the invisible sister, the afterthought. I would disappear from the life they dictated, and one day I would return not as they imagined me, but as something larger than their laughter could ever contain. The night air was cool against my skin. I stood still, letting the vow sink deep, settling like a seed that knew its time would come. No tears burned my eyes. No plea rose to my lips. There was only silence, heavy with promise. Someday they would not be able to look past me. When I stepped back inside, the ballroom glowed the same as before. I sat among them, smiling when expected, quiet, when unnoticed, as though nothing had shifted. But within me, everything had changed. My silence no longer surrendered. It was the beginning of my disappearance, the quiet oath that one day I would return carrying more than they could ever imagine. The laughter from Ethan's cruel words still clung to me, faint, but cutting like smoke after a fire. I sat frozen, my glass trembling lightly between my fingers. The violins carried on weaving their polished music through the air, but to me they sounded muffled, as if I were trapped inside a shell of glass. My smile remained fixed, brittle as porcelain, a mask I wore, only so no one could see how hollow I felt beneath it. Shame and anger tangled inside me, swirling so tightly I could hardly breathe. Then the MC's voice rang out, cheerful and grand, inviting my parents to the stage. My heart sank, tightening in a way that felt achingly familiar. I already knew what I would hear. Their praises had followed the same rhythm all my life, a script so well rehearsed I could recite it myself. My father, Robert, stood tall in his tuxedo, his expression calm and practiced. The microphone in his hand seemed an extension of him, another instrument for control. His voice carried through the hall, deep and measured, brimming with pride. "Ethan is the shining example of our family," he declared. "A son of ambition, a leader, a husband who makes us proud." The applause swept over the room, polished and polite. My palms joined in striking together with a sound that burned. Each clap felt like a betrayal of myself, as if I were applauding the reminder of my own invisibility. My chest tightened with every hollow beat of my hands. Then my mother, Patricia, stepped forward. Her gown shimmered in champagne silk, her pearl necklace catching the stage light with a cold gleam. She smiled with that graceful ease that society loved her for, every gesture honed from years of practice. "We could not be happier," she said, "to see Ethan achieve everything that the Morgan name should represent." Her gaze floated across the crowd, her smile landing on Ethan, on his radiant bride, on the guests clinking their glasses. It skimmed past me entirely. In her eyes, I might have been a shadow or a chair. When they returned to the table, still glowing in the aftertaste of applause, my mother leaned toward me. Her perfume wrapped around me, familiar, yet suffocating, a blend of rose and powder I had known since childhood. But that night it felt heavier, almost oppressive. She placed her manicured hand gently on my arm, the gesture tender to an outsider's eye. Her smile curved like silk. "Rachel," she whispered, "you should learn to support your brother quietly. A proper sister knows how to stay in the background. Don't distract from the family's pride with little things." The words pierced sharper than Ethan's public cruelty. His barb had humiliated me in front of a crowd, but my mother's whisper was deliberate, private, and coldly clear. Even when I had spoken modestly without trying to claim any spotlight, they still found a way to press me back into silence. I sat stiff, my glass cool against my palm. My throat tightened, words pressing against it, desperate to be spoken. I wanted to ask her what she thought my life was worth beyond the shadow of Ethan's success. But the question remained locked inside me, hard and immovable. All I managed was a shallow nod, a performance of obedience. Then under the table, something warm slid into my hand. A smaller palm, soft, steady. "Lauren." My younger sister leaned close, her voice a trembling thread of air. "You're not invisible, Rachel. They're just blind." The words rushed through me like warmth in winter. My eyes stung, though no tears fell. Gratitude tightened my chest, though my lips could only manage the faintest curve of a smile. I turned to her, and in her eyes, I saw something no one else at that table ever gave me recognition. That one sentence, spoken so quietly, was enough to remind me I wasn't completely alone. Around us, the band lifted into a lively tune. Couples rose to dance, dresses swaying, shoes brushing against the polished floor. The room pulsed with celebration. My parents returned to Ethan, their arms looped around him, their faces glowing with the pride they wore so easily. Their laughter spilled into his, a sound woven like a crown of belonging. And me, I sat apart, a shadow blurred into the corner of the frame. Yet as I watched, something began to shift inside me. The ache was deep, yes, but it stirred into something sharper. I realized I could no longer wait for scraps of recognition, could no longer hope for crumbs of affection at a table that had never been set for me. If they would not value me as their daughter, I would force the world to see me as something more. I would not live my life hidden behind Ethan, smothered into silence. The ballroom lights shimmered across crystal glasses and golden chandeliers. But within me, a different light flickered, small but unyielding. I would not fade. I would rise in a way that no whisper could erase. As laughter swelled once more, I sat quietly. But my silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of submission. It was the silence of preparation, the kind that grows before a storm. I swore to myself, as surely as the music carried through the air, that one day they would have no choice but to see me. I once believed marriage would be the shelter my own family never offered me. On the day I stood across from Mark Caldwell with his calm eyes and practiced smile, I thought I had found my harbor. His job at the bank sounded respectable, steady, grounded, everything I told myself I needed. He was polite, never brash like Ethan, and when he slipped the ring onto my finger, I thought I was saying yes to stability, to kindness, to finally being seen for who I was. But what looks calm on the surface can still hold chains beneath it. The first months were quiet enough. I cooked dinners in our little apartment, filling the kitchen with the scent of rosemary chicken and fresh bread. I tried to make the space ours, arranging hand-me-down furniture in ways that suggested comfort. At night, I would sit with him at the small table, my voice carrying a spark of hope as I shared my progress. I told him about my online shop, how I was filling more orders, how I dreamed of adding new products, maybe even hiring help. The words felt like stepping stones to a future. Mark listened, or at least he pretended to. His chair creaked as he leaned back, arms folded across his chest. His brow furrowed, a crease forming as he said flatly, "Rachel, you should focus on being a proper wife. That little shop only distracts you." The words chilled me from the inside out. I forced a faint smile, stirring food on my plate to hide the way my chest hollowed. I nodded as if he was right, but something inside me bent under the weight of his dismissal. The small flame I had been nurturing sputtered, starved of oxygen by the same cold wind I had grown up breathing. Still, I tried again, in smaller ways. I showed him packages stacked neatly by the door, ready for shipment. I let my voice carry quiet pride when I told him a repeat customer had left a glowing review. Each time his reaction was the same, a half smile that did not reach his eyes, a shake of his head, or silence heavy enough to smother me. What he wanted was not a partner, but a woman content with grocery lists and folded laundry. In his eyes, my worth ended at the threshold of our home. Then came the night that split the thin thread of my illusions. I was carrying laundry upstairs, arms filled with folded shirts warm from the dryer, when I heard his voice. It was low-hushed, the kind of tone people use when they think they cannot be overheard. I froze on the steps, the cotton pressing against my chin, and listened. "Yes, Ethan, I'll keep an eye on Rachel. Don't worry, she won't get far." The words pierced through me before I could even take a breath. My knees weakened, my heart pounding so loudly, I feared it might echo into the room below. He wasn't just dismissive. He was reporting to Ethan, my brother, the man who had mocked me, diminished me, erased me in front of the family. And now my husband, the man who had promised to stand beside me, was standing with him instead. I stood there paralyzed, the folded laundry suddenly unbearably heavy in my arms. 1,000 shards of betrayal pressed against me, invisible yet sharp. My husband was not a refuge. He was another extension of their reach. When he hung up, I walked down the stairs slowly, each step deliberate, the wooden boards creaking beneath my feet. He looked up startled, but I did not falter. My voice came steady, though my insides shook. "You're working for Ethan, aren't you?" For a moment he said nothing. Then came the smirk, one I had never noticed before, small, cold, edged with something close to satisfaction. He didn't bother to deny it. He only shrugged as though it were obvious. "He just wants to make sure you don't do anything foolish, Rachel. Don't forget you're part of the Morgan family now. And in this family, Ethan decides." His words were shackles clamping down not with noise but with quiet certainty. My wrists, my ankles, my breath itself seemed bound by the invisible grip of his allegiance. I stared at him, at the man who had once placed a ring on my finger with vows of partnership, who now revealed himself as another gatekeeper to my confinement. A chill rippled through me, not from the night air, but from the truth I could no longer unsee. That night I lay beside him in the bed we shared. His breathing was steady, his back turned to me as if nothing had shifted. But to me the distance stretched wider than oceans. I stared into the darkness, my eyes dry but burning, the ceiling blurring above me. The walls seemed to close in each corner sharper, each shadow longer. The marriage I thought would be my refuge had revealed itself as nothing more than a cage. And the key was not lost. It was gripped firmly in the hands of the very man I had married, with Ethan standing behind him, smug and unseen but ever present. I closed my eyes, my mouth dry with the taste of bitterness. The mattress beneath me no longer felt like a place of rest, but like a trap. And that night, I finally understood. This was not safe. This was captivity. The vows I had once cherished as threads of love had hardened into iron bars. The summer of 2018 pressed down on Austin with a heat that clung to the skin, heavy even in the shade. My parents' backyard was alive with the hum of voices that afternoon, the air thick with chatter from neighbors, colleagues, and Ethan's friends from the firm. The Morgan barbecue had always been more than a gathering. It was a stage. Every year my parents made sure of it. I arrived with Mark at my side, my arms wrapped around a peach cobbler still warm from the oven. It wasn't just dessert. It was a piece of my grandmother, the one who had stood me on a stool in her kitchen and taught me how to fold butter into dough until it gave way beneath my fingers. I had woken early that morning, kneaded carefully, brushing the crust with egg wash, hoping that this time my effort might be seen. The smell of grilled meat drifted through the air, mixing with sunscreen and freshly cut grass. Children darted across the lawn, their laughter bouncing against the wooden fence. I carried the cobbler to the long buffet table, its surface crowded with dishes. I set it down gently, the crust golden, the filling bubbling just beneath the surface. My mother approached. Her eyes passed over the dish, without pause, her expression unreadable. Then with a flick of her hand she called a server. "Take this to the kitchen. Make room for the tiramisu Ethan and his wife brought." The words landed sharp. I felt the tray lighten in my hands as the cobbler was lifted away. The centerpiece of the table remained empty, reserved as though Ethan's dessert were a crown. I stood in the glow of the Texas sun, my smile held in place while my offering disappeared behind swinging doors. Later, with plates filled and glasses lifted, conversation swirled easily around the yard. Laughter rose above the hum of cicadas, the sound of ice clinking in tumblers. I sat among them, quiet but determined. My palms dampened as I took a breath, summoning courage. My voice trembled at first, but steadied as I spoke. I told them my small shop had just signed, with a local chain of stores, my first real step forward. I thought foolishly that perhaps someone might clap, that perhaps Lauren might squeeze my hand, that maybe my parents' eyes would hold a flicker of pride. Instead, Ethan leaned forward, his smile sharp. His voice cut clean through mine. "Everyone listen. Rachel thinks her little online shop is a business. Isn't that adorable? If she disappeared tomorrow, no one would notice." The laughter that followed rose louder than the music. It swelled and spilled over me, drowning my words. I froze my plate heavy in my hands, the edges digging into my palms. Across from me, Mark smiled faintly, joining in, though he avoided my eyes. That was the sharper sting, the small betrayal of the man beside me. The joke was cruel, and his silence was worse. At that moment, I felt stripped bare. Not only dismissed as a woman with ambition, but erased as a person. They weren't laughing at my business. They were laughing at the idea that I mattered at all. Something inside me shifted. I didn't cry. I didn't flee. Instead, I reached for my glass of water. My hand trembled only for a second before I steadied it. Slowly, deliberately, I raised it in a quiet toast. My eyes locked on Ethan's, steady and unblinking. Challenge accepted. For a heartbeat, the air stilled. The laughter faltered, caught like breath before a storm. Ethan's grin twitched just for a moment. Then someone cleared their throat, and the conversation tumbled forward, spilling into safer topics. The moment passed for them. For me, it cracked something open that could never be sealed again. When the evening waned and Mark drove us home, I sat silent in the passenger seat. The hum of the engine filled the silence, the glow of streetlights sliding across my face in fleeting streaks of yellow. My fingers curled tight in my lap, leaving crescents against my skin. By the time we reached the house, I felt hollow, as though laughter had scraped me clean from the inside. I didn't undress. I didn't wipe away the makeup smudged by the heat. I sat in the dark living room, the silence pressing heavy against my shoulders. Every laugh replayed in my head, every dismissive glance etched sharper with each recall. My chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, and in that rhythm, I thought of all the years I had stayed waiting, hoping, longing to be seen. That night, the silence gave me my answer. Recognition would not come. Not from them. Not from Mark. Not from the family who had made me a shadow at their table. I could not remain in a house, in a marriage, in a family where I was treated as less than real. If they wanted me to vanish, I would. But it would not be the vanishing they meant. It would not be into nothingness. It would be out of the cage they had built around me. I would vanish from the place where they had silenced me, and I would return someday on my own terms. Tomorrow, I told myself as the clock ticked into the dark. Tomorrow I will disappear. And for the first time, the thought didn't terrify me. It steadied me. It felt like breath after drowning a seed pressed into soil, ready to take root far from the laughter that had once buried me. The next morning, sunlight poured through the blinds in golden bands, warm against the walls. Yet inside me, there was only stillness. My mind felt sharper than it had in years. There was no more bargaining with myself, no hesitation. The choice had already been made. That day I would leave. I would not announce it, would not beg for understanding, would not wait for permission that had never been given. If they believed my absence would mean nothing, then I would vanish, but not in the way they imagined. I would disappear on my own terms, and I would return as someone they could no longer deny. Mark left early for work. I listened to the familiar sequence, the click of the door, the turn of the lock, the engine rumbling in the driveway, then fading into silence. My heart thudded in my chest so loud it filled my ears. I rose slowly, steadying my breath, and began to pack. Not much, only what mattered. My laptop, the spine of my shop. A folder with invoices, design sketches, contracts, the proof of nights I had poured into building something real. A few changes of clothes. And my small black notebook, its pages filled with late-night scribbles, sketches, dreams I had been too afraid to speak aloud. I walked into the kitchen one last time. Morning light struck the counter where Mark and I had eaten countless silent meals. I remembered the way he scrolled his phone while I spoke, my words hanging in the air unanswered. My hand slid the wedding ring from my finger. It felt heavier than gold, heavy with disappointment. I placed it on the table. The small metallic clink echoed in the quiet, final, and absolute. Beside it, I left a torn sheet of paper, my handwriting slanted and hurried. I need time. Don't look for me. My hands trembled as I picked up the car keys. The old sedan groaned when I turned the ignition, the engine coughing to life. My pulse raced, a mixture of fear and exhilaration. It was as if I were stealing myself back piece by piece from a life that had never truly belonged to me. I pressed harder on the pedal. The road stretched northward, open and waiting. I aimed for Seattle toward Lauren, the only person who had ever looked at me and seen more than a shadow. The miles blurred. Texas fields rolled past, fading into stretches of highway. I stopped only for gas and coffee, the rest of the world a haze. Memories haunted me in fragments. Ethan's smirk sharp as glass. My mother's whisper soft yet suffocating. Mark's voice in the living room offering me up as someone to be monitored. Each recollection pushed my foot heavier against the pedal. My back ached. My eyes stung, but I never turned back. Seattle greeted me with gray skies and the smell of rain, a city wrapped in damp quiet. I found a tiny apartment above a laundromat, barely wide enough for a narrow bed, a desk, and the boxes I carried. The walls were thin, the carpet worn, but when I closed the door for the first time in years, the space felt like mine. The first weeks were unforgiving. Orders came in drips, barely enough to cover rent. Nights blurred as I bent over the desk, sealing packages with hands that shook from exhaustion. Each label I pressed down felt less like a name on a box than a plea to the world. See me, don't erase me. My savings thinned. Some nights, dinner was no more than a cup of instant noodles, the steam rising like a reminder of everything temporarily. I would sit there staring at the invoices, the questions pressing hard. Had I been reckless? Was I only proving them right? A foolish woman stumbling in the dark. Every time fatigue whispered that I should give up, I reached back to the voice that had shadowed me for years. If you disappeared tomorrow, no one would notice. I saw Mark's faint smile as he joined in the laughter at the barbecue. I felt my mother's hand on my arm again as she told me to stay in the background. Those memories seared, but they also burned away hesitation. They became the fire that kept me upright on nights when exhaustion threatened to break me. One evening, after days of running on nothing but adrenaline, I sat slumped at the desk, surrounded by stacks of boxes and scattered papers. My body ached. My spirit frayed thin. Then came a knock at the door. I opened it, and there was Lauren, her arms full of a steaming pot of soup. She stepped inside, set it on the stove, and turned slowly, taking in the cramped room, the scattered invoices, the unfinished sketches, the stack of packages waiting for pickup. Her eyes softened, her smile steady and sure. "Rachel," she said gently, "you're not just surviving. You're being reborn." The words fell into me like water on dry earth. For so long I had believed I was running, escaping, erasing. But Lauren was right. This wasn't running. It was a transformation. I wasn't hiding from my family. I was stepping into the person I had been all along. That night we ate together at the tiny table, steam rising from the soup, laughter slipping between us for the first time in years. The room was small, the walls thin, but it felt rich with something I hadn't known in years' hope. Later, when she left, I lay down on the narrow bed, the sound of rain tapping steadily against the window. My eyes closed without resistance. No voices followed me into the dark. No laughter cut through my chest. For the first time in years, I slept deeply. No ridicule. No whispers. No shadow pressing me down. Only the sound of rain washing the past away promised me that tomorrow I would rise not as the forgotten daughter of the Morgans, but as Rachel Morgan, a woman building a life of her own making. Seattle in autumn had a way of seeping into you. The drizzle was constant, soft but insistent, and the air carried a chill that slipped beneath coats and sweaters. Most people rushed through it with bowed heads, but I found myself settling into its rhythm. There was something about that grayness, quiet, persistent, that mirrored the beginnings of my own life here. Cold, yes, but full of promise. The cafe near my apartment had become my refuge. Its scratched wooden tables, the hum of an old espresso machine, the smell of bread just pulled from the oven, all of it felt steady in a way I craved. That morning the place was unusually still. 2 students hunched over laptops with headphones pressed tight. An older couple at the counter shared a muffin, their conversation low and unhurried. I slipped into my corner table, opened my laptop, and spread out my folders. My small shop was steady now. Orders came almost daily, enough to pay rent, enough to prove survival was possible. But Ethan's voice lived inside me still. If you disappeared tomorrow, no one would notice. Survival wasn't enough. I needed more. I needed to break free of his words, not just disprove them. I was sketching an idea on a napkin when the cafe owner approached. A woman in her 50s with cropped silver hair and sharp, assessing eyes. She set down my coffee, but instead of walking away, she studied me. "You're here every morning," she said, her tone more curious than nosy. "Always working, always typing. What are you building?" Something about her directness disarmed me. I could have brushed her off, but I didn't. "It's a small online shop," I said quietly. "Household products. Just small things, really, but—" She leaned closer before I could finish. "Show me." I hesitated, then turned my laptop toward her. The screen displayed the designs I had been nursing like fragile seeds, compact kitchen tools that hid technology inside their simplicity, clever storage systems drawn in clean lines, little inventions imagined late at night when loneliness pressed in. She studied them for a long moment, the silence so complete my chest tightened. I braced myself for the familiar look, dismissal, amusement, the faint curl of a smile that said, "How quaint." But then she smiled differently, her whole face softening. "You have talent, Rachel. Real talent. But you're still living inside the box your family built for you. They told you to think small, and you believed them. It's time to step out." She extended her hand. "My name's Eleanor Harris. Let me help you." The words landed like nothing I had heard before. Help, believe, talent. I had lived years without hearing them spoken to me sincerely. My hand trembled as I shook hers, but somewhere deep inside something shifted awake. Over the weeks that followed, Eleanor became more than the woman behind the counter. She was a mentor, sharp, relentless, but steady as stone. She had built and sold businesses, lost, and started again. When she spoke, the air seemed to bend toward her authority. She introduced me to local business owners, nudged me into conversations I would once have avoided, and never allowed me to minimize myself. "Stop underselling yourself, Rachel," she told me again and again. "Don't shrink to fit their view of you. People pay for expertise, not pity." At first I resisted. Compliments felt foreign, almost dangerous, like stepping into light that might burn. Could I really rise to the level of her faith? What if failure proved Ethan right, proved Mark right, proved my mother right? The voices of my past clung like chains. But Eleanor didn't let me retreat. One afternoon, she slid a folder across my table. Inside was a proposal from a regional coffee chain branding, packaging, digital storefront. A project far larger than anything I had touched before. Her eyes held mine. "This is yours if you want it. Show them what you can do." Her challenge ignited something in me. That night my apartment was filled with scraps of work. Drafts, sketches, ideas sprawled across every surface. I worked until the lines between day and night blurred, until my eyes burned from the screen's glow. Each time doubt clawed at me. I heard Ethan's laugh. Mark's voice dismissing me, my mother's whisper telling me to stay in the background. And each time something stubborn inside me answered back. Not this time. The day of the presentation, I carried my portfolio into the meeting room with my palms damp and throat dry. Across the table, executives waited, faces unreadable. My voice wavered at first as I laid out the designs. Then, as the words gathered strength, I saw them lean forward, studying intently, flipping through the samples with care. The silence stretched until one of them finally leaned back, a faint smile breaking his reserve. "This is fresh," he said. "Exactly what we've been looking for." Relief hit me so strong my knees nearly gave out. I managed a smile, real, unforced, unlike the brittle mask I had worn at every Morgan gathering. That afternoon I signed my first major contract. It was worth more than everything I had earned up until then combined. When I stepped outside, drizzle met my face. It didn't chill me. It cleansed. Each drop felt like quiet applause, as if the city itself had been waiting for me. That evening I returned to the cafe where it had all begun. Eleanor sat across from me, eyes bright with satisfaction. She reached across the table, her hand warm against mine. "This is just the beginning, Rachel," she said softly. "Today you opened the first door. There is more waiting." I glanced past her through the rain-streaked window, where neon lights blurred into ribbons of color. The rain no longer felt heavy. It felt like the world itself was washing me clean, clearing a path forward. For the first time, I didn't just see survival. I saw a future, and for once I wasn't afraid of it. The months that followed felt like a storm sweeping me from one challenge to the next. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the storm. That first contract with the coffee chain had shifted something fundamental. Suddenly, I wasn't just the woman running a shop out of a cramped apartment. I had proof. I had a portfolio. And with that came whispers, introductions, careful nods of recognition. People began to see me not as a hobbyist tinkering in the margins, but as someone daring to step into the arena of smart home design. I rented a small office in Capitol Hill. It wasn't much: 3 desks, mismatched chairs, and a filing cabinet that groaned every time it opened, but to me it felt like a palace. The first day I unlocked that door, the smell of old carpet and fresh paint wrapped around me. I stood still, keys warm in my palm, and breathed in the feeling of ownership. For the first time in my life, I held something no one could take away or dismiss with a glance. With that office came my first hires: 2 design graduates, eager and raw, and a young programmer whose fingers flew across the keyboard like sparks. Their eyes carried the same hunger I once thought belonged only to me. We didn't have glossy advertising or the shine of big money. What we had was sleepless energy, cheap coffee, and a conviction that together we could carve something real out of doubt. The projects trickled in at first: a small startup selling kitchen gadgets, a local retailer wanting custom smart storage solutions. Each contract was modest, but each signature on paper felt like another stone laid in the foundation of a house no one believed I could build. At night, after locking the office, I would stand in the doorway and imagine the walls of that house rising higher floor by floor, even if no one else could see it yet. But success has its own way of testing resolve. As the work grew, so did the demands. Clients wanted faster delivery, sleeker designs, flawless execution. I was learning on the job, stumbling more often than I admitted. Then came the first real crisis: a shipping delay that snowballed into disaster. An entire batch of products missed its deadline. The call came just after midnight. My stomach dropped, my hands turned cold. All I could see was Ethan's smirk, the one that had followed me since his wedding, his laughter spilling across the table, while mine was the name turned into a punchline. That memory rose like a ghost in the room, mocking me again. Whispers spread quickly in local business circles. "She just got lucky. She doesn't belong here." I heard the words secondhand, but they landed like chains around my chest. For a night I sat alone in the office, staring at the walls, the silence pressing in until I could barely breathe. I wondered if I should quit, if perhaps this was the proof they had been waiting for, that Rachel Morgan was nothing but a fleeting rumor destined to vanish. Then I looked at my team. Their faces were young, tired, but hopeful, waiting for me to lead. They believed in me even when I faltered. I thought of Eleanor's voice telling me not to shrink. I thought of Lauren's whisper years ago, soft but certain. "You're not invisible, Rachel. They're just blind." If I gave up now, I would prove every cruel glance, every dismissive word right. So I did the hardest thing I could. I faced the client myself. I walked into their office, heart pounding so hard it echoed in my ears, and admitted the mistake. I didn't offer excuses. I promised to make it right. Their silence was heavy, each second stretching long, but I stood in it without looking away. Then I returned to the office and gathered my team. Together we stripped the old system down to its bones and rebuilt it piece by piece. We tightened shipping, improved tracking, and doubled our quality checks. For weeks we lived on takeout and late-night coffee, our bodies dragging but our determination unshaken. And when the next order came, we delivered it not only on time, but better than expected. The client surprised me. Instead of walking away, they renewed the contract. More than that, they praised me. Called me a CEO who owned her responsibility. That word CEO echoed in me. I had been called many things before: a proper wife, a background sister, a distraction. Never a leader. Never someone in control of her own story. For the first time, I let myself believe it. One night, long after everyone had gone home, I sat alone in that little office. The streetlight outside cast a pale glow across the floor. The room smelled faintly of ink and coffee papers and sketches scattered across the desks. On the bulletin board, contracts and deadlines pinned side by side, each one a quiet testament that I had carved something out of the silence. I realized then I was no longer Rachel, the girl who had sat frozen at her brother's wedding, laughter crashing over her like a tide. That girl had been left behind. In her place was someone harder, sharper, steadier. Someone who had stumbled and carried failure in her arms only to turn it into momentum. We weren't a household name yet. We weren't making millions. But we were building brick by brick, and I could feel the walls rising higher each day. Quiet, relentless, unseen, and the Morgans in their polished world of spotlights and champagne had no idea. That thought made me smile in the stillness. I called it my silent rise. They hadn't noticed yet, but soon they would. And when the world finally saw me standing in full light, no one would ever mistake me for a shadow again. 3 years had passed since the night I left Texas behind, and in that time the world I built had stretched far beyond anything I once dared to imagine. The tiny apartment above the laundromat, the chipped desk where I first packed orders by hand, felt like a distant memory. Now I walked through glass doors into an office humming with energy. 20 employees filled the space, their keyboards clicking in unison, their voices trading ideas, their eyes carrying the same fire I once nursed alone at my kitchen table. Contracts from national retail chains sat neatly in folders on my desk. Our products filled shelves in stores where I had once wandered as an anonymous customer. Yet even as success mounted, I kept myself hidden. I had no hunger for interviews or lights, no need to sit across from a camera and sell my story. I wanted the work to speak louder than my name, the designs to slip quietly into homes without anyone needing to know who created them. Silence had been my shield, and I had grown comfortable inside it. That morning when I stepped into the office, the atmosphere felt different, charged in a way I couldn't yet name. My team stood gathered around the television mounted on the wall. Their faces were pale, their voices hushed, their attention pinned to the screen. I joined them, slowly, cautious steps, carrying me closer until the voice of the reporter rang out sharp and unmistakable. Behind one of the fastest-growing lines of smart home products in the United States stands a mysterious CEO whose story is as remarkable as the empire she's building. The image shifted to our products, sleek packaging, polished designs, clips of customers unwrapping them with delight. And then my name appeared, stamped across the screen in bold letters. Rachel Morgan. The sound drained from the room. My ears rang, my breath caught. My name, once the subject of jokes, once brushed aside at dinner tables, now carried across the country in broadcast tones. My secret was no longer mine. A journalist had pieced together what I had hidden so carefully, tracing filings and contracts until they led straight to me. My fingers gripped the back of a chair, the wood pressing sharply into my palm. Around me, my employees erupted into applause, their cheers rising, some even laughing with joy. They were proud, and rightly so. Their work, our work, was now recognized. But inside me, pride tangled with something darker, heavier. A memory stirred the way Ethan had once leaned back in his chair, laughing as though my existence could vanish without leaving even a ripple. That echo rose again, but this time it struck against a wall of undeniable proof. Once they had said I could vanish without consequence. Now my presence filled the headlines. The rest of the day blurred into noise. My phone would not stop ringing. By noon, the battery drained under the weight of messages. Reporters demanded interviews, investors pressed for meetings, strangers who had once ignored me now typed frantic invitations into my inbox. Even distant relatives I barely remembered sent warm greetings, attaching themselves to me as if success could rewrite years of silence. Then came the message I never thought I would see. A text from my mother. "Rachel, we need to talk. Ethan wants to see you too." The The words seared into me, each letter a reminder of the silence that had stretched across years. Not once had she asked if I was safe in Seattle. Not once had Ethan reached out except through scorn. And now when the world turned its gaze on me, suddenly I mattered. Suddenly I was worth their time. Anger rose sharp and bitter. It wasn't new. I had carried it since that wedding table, since that barbecue, since every moment I was told to be small. But now it came with clarity. They had not changed. They had not softened. The only thing that had shifted was me. That night I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window of my apartment. The city pulsed below me, headlights sliding across rain-slicked streets, silver streaks cutting down the glass. The glow of my laptop lit the room, pulling my eyes again and again to the headline. Mysterious CEO builds billion-dollar empire from scratch. I whispered the words aloud as if testing their weight. They felt foreign, heavy, and yet wholly mine. For a fleeting moment I almost laughed, not from joy but from disbelief. Once they had treated me as if I could be erased without a trace. Now the evidence of my presence was carved across the nation's news. I leaned closer to the window, my reflection layered over the city lights. I searched the face staring back. It was not the humiliated girl at Ethan's wedding. It was not the invisible daughter in a family gathering, nor the silenced wife at a table where her voice was dismissed. It was someone else now, a woman who had carved her name into a world that once refused to acknowledge her. Pride should have been enough. But under it, something colder coiled. Exposure. Recognition was not safe. It was a spotlight, and with it came shadows I could not yet see. For all my victories, I knew the Morgans would not sit quietly while I stood in the light. Confrontation was inevitable, but this time the stage would not belong to them. The next time we stood across from each other, it would not be Rachel, the daughter blurred into the background. It would be Rachel Morgan, CEO, a name spoken on screens across the country. A woman the world was already watching. I told myself I was ready. My heart insisted I had prepared for this moment all along. Yet in the quiet of that room, as the rain pressed steady against the glass, a chill settled deep. Because to face them now was no longer about family. It was about legacy. And with every fiber of me, I knew the storm was only beginning. The morning of the National Technology Conference in San Francisco arrived faster than I expected, a current pulling me forward, whether I was ready or not. From my hotel window, the skyline shimmered in the early light towers of glass, catching the sun and reflecting it into sharp brilliance. I stood before the mirror, smoothing the emerald jumpsuit that hugged me in all the right ways. My caramel bob framed my jaw with precision, and the 3-inch heels gave me both height and grounding. For a long moment I stared at the reflection. I remembered another reflection, once a younger version of myself in a navy dress at Ethan's wedding, shoulders tucked in, clutching a glass, while laughter broke around me like waves. That woman was gone. The one staring back now was Rachel Morgan, CEO of a billion-dollar empire, and today the world would see her. The conference hall buzzed with electricity. Every corner pulsed with chatter, flashes from cameras, the low hum of ambition in the air. Rows of business leaders, investors, and journalists filled the seats, their faces turned toward the stage with expectation. When my name was announced, applause thundered through the hall, crashing against me like a tide. My heels clicked with every step across the polished floor, my pulse beating in rhythm with the sound. I spoke. My voice, once timid in family gatherings, carried steady and full. I outlined our vision for the future of smart home technology, the milestones we had crossed, the possibilities ahead. Every sentence landed firmly, every pause filled with attention. For years I had lived unseen, my words swallowed or dismissed. But here every ear leaned toward me, every gaze anchored on me. And then in the front row, I saw them. My mother Patricia sat poised, pearls glinting under the stage lights. My father Robert leaned back, posture practiced, pride painted into the lines of his face. And between them, Ethan. His navy suit looked impeccable. His smirk sharpened into the same expression he had worn when he told a room full of people that no one would notice if I disappeared. My chest tightened, but my words never faltered. I finished my talk with my gaze sweeping across them, my voice carrying not just to the audience, but to the family that had silenced me. Applause roared when I stepped down. Then came the wave reporters pushing forward with questions. Business leaders reaching for my hand, hurried whispers of partnership and opportunity. The air was thick with perfume cologne and the metallic tang of ink from press kits. I signed a memorandum with a new partner pen in hand when I heard it. Clapping. Slow, deliberate. I turned, and there was Ethan. His eyes locked on mine, the grin at the edge of his mouth dripping with mockery. "Impressive, Rachel," he said, his voice pitched just enough to be overheard. "Who would have thought that little online shop of yours would turn into this?" A ripple of heat surged through me, but I kept my face calm. Years of practice and restraint steadied me now. "You're right, Ethan," I said evenly. "You never would have thought." His eyes narrowed, the grin flickering for the briefest second. Before he could answer, my mother reached for my hand. Her perfume enveloped me, familiar and suffocating at once. Her smile was soft, perfectly rehearsed, her tone coaxing. "Rachel, darling, we're family. Why didn't you tell us sooner Ethan is expanding his marketing firm? You two could do such great things together." I pulled my hand back, not abruptly, but with unmistakable intent. My gaze met hers, clear and cold. When all I had was a small shop, this family laughed at me. "Now that I've built an empire, you come asking for a share." The words dropped heavy in the air. For one heartbeat, the noise of the crowd seemed to vanish, silence pressing against us. Ethan stepped forward, his smile erased. His voice lowered, but the sharpness in it cut through. "Don't forget, Rachel, we share the same blood. Alone you won't get far." Something rose inside me then, something steady and unshakable. I lifted my chin, the weight of years pressing into my words. "You were wrong once, Ethan. And this time, I'll make sure the whole world sees just how wrong you are again." His jaw clenched, the smirk gone at last. Anger shadowed his face, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of another glance. I turned, walking away as the clamor of the conference swelled back to life. My heels struck the marble with crisp finality, each step carrying the weight of everything I had endured. Hands reached for mine, voices called my name, but inside my focus was steel. I had faced them. I had stood before Ethan, before the parents who had never truly seen me, and I had not broken. The chains of invisibility had shattered. In my chest, a cold fire burned, not of anger alone, but of resolve. The real battle was only beginning, and I felt it gathering like a storm on the horizon. But this time, I would not be the girl waiting in the corner to be acknowledged. I was Rachel Morgan, and I was ready to meet the reckoning head-on. After the San Francisco conference, the storm gathered so quickly it nearly unsteadied me. Reporters trailed my every move, headlines called me the mysterious CEO who had finally stepped into the light, and contracts poured into my company with the force of a rising tide. For years I had clawed at the edges of recognition, begging silently for someone to see me. Now it came all at once, fierce and unrelenting. Among the flood of opportunities, one name made my stomach twist when I saw it. Caldwell Marketing, Ethan's company. The board had positioned them as the marketing partner in a multi-million-dollar deal. I almost laughed at the cruelty of it. Fate had drawn a perfect circle, placing him directly in my path. But I knew this wasn't a chance. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Ethan had mocked me, diminished me, dismissed me, and now for the first time he would stand across from me, not as the brother who had buried me in laughter, but as a rival facing his reckoning. The meeting was set in a glass tower downtown, the kind of place where ambition shimmered in every reflective surface. I arrived early, the echo of my heels bouncing against the marble floor as I entered the boardroom. My executives were already seated, papers fanned out neatly before them. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh coffee, its silence heavy with expectation. Then he entered. Ethan. His charcoal suit fit perfectly, his smile rehearsed into a gleaming facade. He moved with the same arrogant ease I remembered from every family gathering, every moment he took center stage, while I vanished into the corners. He shook hands with the directors, his laugh warm, his tone controlled. When he reached me, his hand lingered for a second too long, forcing civility where none existed. "Rachel," he said, his voice dripping with charm. I'm looking forward to working together. I met his gaze steady and cool, offering no more than a nod. The presentation began. Ethan spoke first, his words smooth as silk, laying out projections, strategies, and promises. The directors leaned forward, eyes shining with approval. To them, he was the seasoned executive, the man who knew how to command a room. To me, he was the same man who once declared that I could disappear without anyone caring. I let him finish. I let the confidence ripple through the room, let them all ride the wave of his practiced bravado. Then, when the moment was right, I reached for the pen resting before me. I placed it on the table with a sharp, deliberate click. The sound sliced through the room. Silence followed so sudden, it seemed the air itself held its breath. "I will be withdrawing my company from this contract," I said. My voice did not shake. My words carried across the table clear and final. "We will not be working with Caldwell Marketing." The air cracked open. Papers shifted. A director stammered, "Rachel, perhaps there's been some misunderstanding." But Ethan's voice cut through sharp and rising. His face drained of its confident glow. His jaw clenched as he pushed up from his chair. "Rachel, are you out of your mind? Do you know how many parties are tied into this deal? You'll ruin yourself." I turned toward him fully. Years of humiliation and silence hardened in me like stone. "I am not mistaken, Ethan. I will not hand the future of my empire to a man who once told me my absence would mean nothing." His composure cracked. His fists tightened against the table, his voice dropping low-edged with venom. "You're destroying yourself. Blood is blood, Rachel. You can't win by turning against your own family." I tilted my head slightly calm in the face of his fury. "No, Ethan. Family is meant to support, not to shackle. I broke free of the cage you built around me. From now on, you will be the one forced to live in my shadow." The words hung in the room, weighty and unshakable. The directors shifted in their seats, eyes darting between us, their fascination barely concealed. Ethan's mask slipped further, the polished surface giving way to cracks of desperation. His face flushed, a sheen of sweat forming along his hairline. I pulled the papers closer, sliding the withdrawal form beneath my hand. My pen moved across the page with a steady rhythm, each stroke of ink louder in my ears than the chaos around me. The sound of severing ties. The sound of vengeance written not in anger but in resolve. When I finished, I pushed the papers forward. Ethan collapsed back into his chair, his breath heavy, his polished facade shattered. His eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but no one returned his gaze. At that moment, he was no longer the golden son of the Morgan family, no longer the untouchable heir. He was simply a man stripped of the illusion of power, revealed in the light of his own downfall. I rose from my chair, gathering my folder, my movements deliberate and unhurried. Without another glance at Ethan, I pushed open the heavy glass doors. The room behind me remained hushed, the weight of what had transpired pressing on every person left inside. As I walked down the long hallway, my heels striking the marble in measured rhythm, I felt it settle within me. The first strike had landed. This was not just business. This was the answer to years of silence, the response to every smirk, every laugh, every dismissal. This was the beginning of Ethan Morgan's undoing. The decision I made in that boardroom spread like wildfire. Within days, my name filled headlines in bold, unrelenting letters. CEO Rachel Morgan refuses Caldwell Marketing Partnership. Reporters dissected every angle. Commentators debated my motives, and Ethan's carefully crafted reputation began to splinter under the glare of public scrutiny. Investors pulled their money and the stock price of Caldwell Marketing plunged as if someone had cut the rope holding it up. I told myself this was justice. This was the promise I had carved into my heart the night of Ethan's wedding when he mocked me in front of every person I loved. And yet as each headline grew louder, a heaviness crept into my chest, an ache I hadn't anticipated. One morning, while I sat at my desk in Seattle reviewing new contracts, my phone lit up with a name I hadn't seen in years. Mother. My fingers hovered over the screen, my hand trembling before I pressed accept. Rachel, her voice came through thick with something between anger and desperation. "You are tearing this family apart. Your brother has lost everything. Your father is making himself sick with worry. Do Do you hate us that much? For a moment, my throat closed. My breath caught like a knot in my chest. I saw her face as it had been at Ethan's wedding, glowing with pride as she praised her golden son while I sat invisible. I remembered the barbecue, the way she told the waiter to take my cobbler away and make space for Ethan's dessert. Hate, I whispered, barely recognizing the sound of my own voice. No, Mother. I don't hate you. I just gave back exactly what you handed me all these years. Her silence was louder than anything she could have said. I heard the faint sound of her breath uneven before she exhaled a broken sigh and hung up without goodbye. I sat frozen, the phone still pressed to my ear, my pulse racing as if I had been struck. A week later, Lauren appeared at my office. My sister, the only one who had ever offered me kindness when no one else could, walked in with eyes full of worry. She wrapped her arms around me, holding me tightly as tears slipped onto my shoulder. Rachel, she whispered, the family is crumbling. Father blames Mother. Mother blames Ethan. Ethan blames everyone but himself. It is chaotic. She pulled back her gaze, steady, her voice trembling. Part of me believes they deserve this. But I'm afraid, Rachel. I'm afraid you won't find peace in it. Her words pierced deeper than she could have known. I wanted to believe vengeance would fill the hollow places inside me, that justice would bring peace. But in the quiet hours when no one was watching, I felt something else pressing down, something heavy, something that gnawed at the edges of triumph. That evening the television flickered with images of Ethan. He stumbled out of Caldwell headquarters. His once sharp suit rumpled, his proud posture collapsed into something smaller, beaten down by the weight of collapse. The anchor's voice was merciless. Caldwell marketing on the brink of collapse. His wife, once always by his side, with perfect smiles for the cameras, was nowhere to be seen. I poured myself a glass of wine and lifted it slowly, letting the bitterness linger on my tongue. It should have tasted sweet, this long-awaited moment of victory. Instead, it was sharp, sour, almost unbearable. I had achieved what I swore I would. Ethan had been stripped of the pride he wielded, so freely forced to face the humiliation he once dealt to me like entertainment. And yet the question would not leave me. Was this really the victory I wanted? The rain beat hard against the glass of my apartment window, streaks of water cutting through the glow of the city beyond. I stood there, the glass cool beneath my fingertips, and in the reflection, I didn't see the triumphant CEO splashed across the news. I saw the younger version of myself seated at that wedding table, clutching her glass as the laughter rose around her. That girl had vowed the world would notice her. And now it did. But the cost pressed heavy in my chest. The Morgan family. The same family that once made me feel invisible was crumbling piece by piece, undone not by strangers, but by its own choices. I had been the spark, but the fire was theirs. And as I stood watching the storm outside, I understood that the real choice was no longer about Ethan or even about justice. The choice was about me. Would I keep pressing until there was nothing left of them but ashes? Or would I turn away, let go and claim a freedom that vengeance alone could never give me? The storm outside raged on the city, blurred behind the curtain of rain. But deep inside me, a storm far greater searched for its end. A year slipped by after I tore that contract apart. In the world of business, 12 months is enough time for empires to rise and collapse, for reputations to be built and destroyed. Caldwell Marketing was no longer the gleaming tower it once pretended to be. It had shrunk into a shadow, spoken of only as a cautionary tale in the margins of business magazines. Ethan had been stripped of his position, his name now tied to failure rather than pride. My parents retreated into silence, their voices dulled by shame and the fractured pieces of loyalty they could no longer hold together. As for me, my company soared past the $5 billion mark. Contracts filled my desk faster than I could sign them. Cameras followed me through airports, magazine covers, hailed me as the most powerful female CEO no one saw coming. People who once dismissed me now stretched their hands toward me with eager smiles. Yet in the midst of the applause, I carried a strange heaviness in my chest, like a weight that refused to lift. I had fought so hard to be seen. I had burned years of silence into fuel, and transformed humiliation into a throne. I had won. But as the noise swelled, I found myself asking, what was I winning for now? The answer arrived one crisp morning in Seattle. The air outside my window was cool and sharp, the bay mist rolling in as the city stirred awake. My phone lit up on the desk beside me, and when I glanced at the name, my heart faltered. Ethan. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Letting the call fade into silence would have been easy. But something in me pressed accept. His voice came through stripped of all the arrogance and smoothness it once carried. No bravado, no smirk, only exhaustion. Rachel, you've already won. I've lost everything. If you want me on my knees, I'll do it. Just tell me. What else do you want? The silence between us stretched heavy and unfamiliar. I had imagined this moment for years, dreamt of savoring his defeat, of hearing him acknowledge me at last. But now hearing it, the triumph I once craved felt strangely hollow. My throat tightened. I whispered nothing and ended the call. The ache in my chest deepened, one that success and recognition could not soothe. That evening I sat across from Eleanor in her favorite cafe, the one with the smell of roasted beans and fresh bread that always seemed to anchor her. The woman who had guided me through the ashes of my past watched me with eyes that had seen more lives than mine. I leaned forward, lowering my voice as if the truth might shatter if spoken too loudly. I don't feel happy. I have everything I thought I wanted, but there is no peace in me. Eleanor's smile was gentle, tinged with sadness, but also understanding. Because revenge. Rachel only lends you power for a while. Forgiveness is not for them, it is for yourself. That is where freedom begins. Her words followed me home, echoing against the walls of my quiet apartment, refusing to let me rest. Long into the night, I sat at my desk staring at a blank page. The city outside was alive with lights, but inside I was suspended in stillness. At last I picked up my pen. Once they said my absence would mean nothing. But I returned, and the world saw me. I don't need you to kneel. I don't need you to whisper my name in regret. Living each day with the memory of how wrong you were is enough. The words flowed out steady, without anger, without trembling. I folded the letter and set it aside. Then I turned to the stack of contracts waiting for my attention. For the first time, my signature felt lighter each stroke, not a battle cry, but a release, as though I was writing myself free from the chains of the past. That evening, I stepped onto my balcony overlooking Elliott Bay. The water shimmered under the city lights, 1,000 fractured stars trembling on its surface. I breathed in deeply, the air cool against my skin, and for the first time in years, there was no bitterness on my tongue. I had not just defeated them, I had reclaimed myself. The Morgan family, the same one that once dismissed me, had crumbled into silence. But that was not the true victory. The triumph lay in the life I had built, one they could never erase, never diminish, no matter how hard they once tried. I thought of the women who had been told they were invisible, the ones mocked for daring to dream, pushed aside for speaking too loudly, underestimated in rooms that pretended not to see them. I thought of their quiet suffering hidden behind practiced smiles, and as I stood there, the night stretching wide over Elliott Bay, I felt the truth settle in me with a gentleness I had never known. The sweetest victory was never their collapse. It was the freedom of standing whole, visible and unshaken in the life I had built. And for the first time,